Well, the church bells are ringing behind me, so it must be noon officially here in Hudson, here in the Valley. So I think we'll get started so we can take advantage of this full hour that we have with you today. Welcome. I'm Heather Logelin, president of the St. Croix Valley Foundation. And on behalf of our foundation and our generous sponsor and partner, First State Bank and Trust, I am delighted to welcome you to Conversations of the Valley. To help kick off today's conversation, I'm going to turn the screen over to Maya O'Connell, who is a student at Hudson High School. Maya is one of 4 young people who this year helped us create videos for our series to share their own personal experiences of race. Here's Maya.
Maya. I am 15 years old. I was born in Mesa, Arizona. Yes, very far from here. And I grew up in Hudson, Wisconsin. I'm really into anime and K-pop, and I love learning different cultures. Like, I love Japan, I love South Korea. So yeah, I have 2 sisters. One is a nurse, one is going to school to be a nurse. I'm the youngest one, so yeah, miss them a lot, but yeah, I love them a lot as well. Very proud of how welcoming we are just to other people, like not just within our own ethnicity and African Americans, but just like every race in general, and how in my opinion, I feel like we don't tend to discriminate. I feel like we're very open and we're very welcoming within our community, and we're just also very, very outgoing people as well. And like we do tend to be not shy, but very just outgoing and like welcoming people. Yes, multiple times before. Definitely in middle school, they wouldn't, like, sitting at like lunch tables would be like, that'd be a very common thing, or I couldn't play because I looked different, and I would always be very sad about it, and I never felt welcomed. And especially living in Hudson where it's predominantly white, I felt I couldn't fit in with the black people, and I could never fit in with the white people. So where do I come into that? So where do I belong? Because I felt I never belonged. Don't be prejudiced and don't be afraid, because not all black people, African Americans act the same. I feel like a lot of people, they're like, oh, do you play basketball? Do you go to church? Do you go to this kind of church? And we don't. We're all different. We all have our own personalities to us, and we're all different. We are good human beings. We're all humans. So don't be afraid and don't be prejudiced, because we're not all the same. We're all different people. Suppressed for so long of our rights, and now we're finally using our voices and we're making a change for the better, and people can see where we come from, where our stance is, and hopefully people can understand where we're coming from and hopefully try to empathize with us and see that we're struggling as a community, and so that they can help our community and help lift our voices so that we can all be equal.
Kindness, it seems like a pretty simple word, and yet right now I know it feels like it's something our country and our world maybe could use a little more of. So a good word for us to lead off on: kindness, stewardship here in the valley of our region's future, compassion for the needs of others. That's really what brought together a group of passionate community leaders and citizens to form a community foundation right here in the Valley 26 years ago. And so today we continue to focus on the unique assets and needs of our region. The mission of the St. Croix Valley Foundation is to enhance the quality of life here in the Valley. And we do that by encouraging and supporting charitable giving, by connecting people and programs, and by encouraging collaboration. Collaboration, bringing individuals and organizations together to find solutions to shared concerns. That's really what these conversations of the Valley are all about getting people together to learn, to think, to talk about how we might respond to current and emerging issues. So the theme of this year's Conversations of the Valley series is racial justice, listening and learning. Next week marks 1 year since the day that George Floyd was killed. This series really sprung from the realization that conversations like this were desperately needed, and not only in racially diverse urban centers, but also in predominantly white regions like the St. Croix Valley. It's our hope that this series on racial justice has brought the experience of Black and Native Americans more clearly into focus for all who call the Valley home. And I want to recognize that not all of us come to these conversations with the same experiences, perspectives, opinions, and that's okay. To really begin to address racism, we need to start with ourselves, and then with being willing to listen and learn from others whose experiences are different from our own. So before we get started, a few words about today's Zoom format. You've noticed that we have muted all participants, and that's really to help keep things running smoothly, but we will have time for questions at the end. So if you have questions, either while Alex is speaking or after you're getting your thoughts together at the end of his remarks, please go ahead and type them into the chat box, and you should be able to access that chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then we do suggest putting Zoom on speaker view so that the majority of your screen is filled with our speaker. But as I mentioned earlier, you can also go to gallery view to scroll through participants and look for old friends. So a brief interactive part of today's presentation. We're going to pop a poll question into your Zoom screen. Please take a minute to answer it, and then we'll share those results at the end of the hour. Okay, so I am delighted to move on to the reason you are all here today, and to introduce our speaker, Alex Pate. A recent headline from the Pioneer Press is a good way to begin an introduction of Alex. Poet, mentor, and teacher, Alex Pate is a 2021 Kay Sexton Award winner for his work in the Minnesota literary community. Now, the Kay Sexton Literary Award is presented annually by the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. I know we have a lot of Friends of Libraries on with us today, and St. Catherine's University, in recognition of long-standing dedication and outstanding work in fostering books, reading, and literary activity in Minnesota. Alex is a prolific writer, with his Amistad novel, which was commissioned by Steven Spielberg to accompany the award-winning film, becoming a New York Times bestseller. Alex's other writings include 7 novels, works of nonfiction, and poetry. In addition to being a valued teacher, mentor, and leader in the Twin Cities literary community, Alex is president and CEO of Innocent Technologies, a program for K-12 educators that aims to transform U.S. public education and disparities by closing the relationship gap between educators and students of color. Since Alex created the Innocent Classroom in 2012, Innocent Technologies has trained more than 3,600 educators in schools across the country. Throughout his career, Alex has attacked racial stereotypes that can limit the realities of people of color. This paragraph from the Innocent Technologies website is a perfect sentiment for our gathering today. It reads, Alex leads his company through his vision for a world in which our children are free to achieve their unlimited potential. Our people are free to live healthily and fully, and our individual humanity is prioritized and valued in the structures of society. Alex, thank you so much for being here with us today. We are ready to listen and learn.
Thank you, Heather. I really appreciate your introduction. Thanks to Angie, everybody at the St. Croix Valley Foundation for this invitation to be with you today. I'm excited to be here this afternoon, and I want to thank everyone out there for choosing to spend your time with me today. It's been a little stressful morning. I was telling the folks at the foundation before we got on. So there's nothing more stressful when you have to do a Zoom presentation than to look up and see that your power, all of the electricity in your house is gone. And to find out that you're the only house in this little area that is suffering such a calamity, and not knowing when it's going to cut back on again. So I feel lucky, fortunate to be here. Power on, computer working, words in front of my face. I can speak. I'm happy in that respect. I also wanted to say how impressed I've been at the quality of the conversations that you've been engaged in so far, for those of you who have watched and listened to the ones that have happened before me. The presentations have been excellent. As I watched them, I was deeply drawn into their differences and the power that they each projected. I think this has been an important series. I can only hope that what I have to say today is equal to the standards my predecessors, so to speak, have established. I can't begin without saying, trumpeting or repeating what Heather just said, without saying that we are at the doorstep of a terrible anniversary, that of the murder of George Floyd. And we are just mere weeks away from the verdict, an historic verdict, which found a white policeman guilty of that murder. Historic for me in my lifetime. Of course, there is so much more that has to happen. I'm not celebrating. This is not a celebratory moment. It is a moment to pay attention to. The past 14 or 15 months have been extremely difficult in the world around me and in the world around you, I'm sure. And my talk today is not about the pain that rivets our country, this region, and our communities right now. It is not precisely about the killing of Dante Wright, nor the passing of so many of our neighbors over the last year from the pandemic. The pain and sadness of the pandemic is so powerful, I would have a hard time processing that publicly right now. There's so much. But no, my talk is not precisely about all the stress and sorrow that wafts around us. It's more about those young people from your community who recorded their feelings, like Maya, and the thoughts about growing up, their thoughts about growing up and going to school and having to deal with the racial reality they were born in or thrust into. They didn't create this reality. They don't have a choice. Our society has not done enough to eradicate race and racism from their lives. I think people thought they had. I think they thought things were better, a lot better, maybe gone. We even had these moments of conversation where people were talking about a post-racial reality. No. It's a shame. But that is what primarily brings me here. The lives of the children that we bring before us. And I'm mostly going to be talking about children of color, and I realize who I'm talking to and where I'm, the St. Croix River Valley and your demographical realities and all of that. I still think it's important. Why I think it's important, why I think it's necessary for me to have a chance to contribute to these conversations and for us to listen and to learn together. Much of what we talk about when we talk about race is usually generalized, often necessarily so, I guess, so that we can comment and critique on its systemic and systematic manifestations, as in the racial bias in healthcare, policing, and education, for example. And this is not a bad thing if we truly desire change in our society. But we sometimes overshoot our ability to make change possible by defining a problem in such a way that we can't see a pathway to its resolution. Perhaps our goals are sometimes beyond our capacity to achieve them. And the challenge we face is even deeper than that. It extends to our own lives and the lives of our family members, our children, our grandchildren, our neighbors, our church members. This thing called racism is like a big stone, and it is not easily crushed. I've written an essay called Juice, where I talk about how folks, since we got to this country, since this country was formed, have been squeezing on this stone, trying to break it. I'm not going to share that with you today, but it will appear in a book at some point. But the stone is not easily crushed. But I'd like to begin with a story. I'm a writer, a novelist, you know that. I tell stories. And so I can't really engage in conversation about anything without a bit of a story. And so the story I'm going to read was called Innocence Found, which is found in a book called Dream Me Home Safely. Again, that's all neither here nor there, but a shorter version of this story is included in my book, The Innocent Classroom. And it's a story that I'm telling a lot these days. And I don't like repeating myself so much, but I'm going to take a chance today because when I'm asked to talk about race and the challenges our culture faces, I haven't found a better way to begin this conversation. One day this past spring, I walked out of my house on my way to do errands when I was immediately hit by an overwhelming sense of sadness. It was such a bright, wondrous day, and the heavy, sweet smell of blooming lilac swirled around me. It should have made me happy, joyous, but instead, it was a certain way the sunlight careened off the buildings and sidewalks, or the smell of spring, or a combination of both that swept me into the past. And no matter how bucolic or sun-swept my memories of the past may be, they almost always leave me sad. And so this story ends in a sadness of sorts, a caution, so to speak. I grew up in North Philadelphia, not far from the Philadelphia Zoo, and enmeshed in a neighborhood of intensity. It was a neighborhood of working class Black folks who had grabbed onto the promise of the American dream and were barely holding on. But on my street, the sun did shine, and Saturdays were full of purposeful activities like cleaning the house and turning the garden hose on cement sidewalks in front of the houses. As a child, I used to love pickles. I still do. Dill, Jewish, sour, sweet and sour, hot, sweet, it didn't matter. Even thinking this now brings a rush of saliva to my mouth. I attended an elementary school a block and a half from my house, and so I'd always run home at lunchtime, eat the food my mother prepared, usually some sort of sandwich and a bowl of soup, and then I'd do or say whatever I had to in order to get out of the house. And with the remaining 15 or 20 minutes I had left before the afternoon bell rang, I would set out for Little John's. Now, Little John's was one of those idiosyncratic stores you can always find in the inner city, a store that might carry an astonishing variety of goods from penny candy to staples, from bread to balloons, but does so in a space barely large enough for 10 people to stand in without touching. And Little John's was even more unusual in that it was a corner store that was actually located in the middle of the block. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out how John had accomplished that feat. It was on Cybert Street, a couple of blocks away in the opposite direction of my school. I remember that as you approached the store, you'd be gently assaulted by this makeshift wooden enclosed stairway that jutted straight out of a block of row houses. It would almost stop you from walking unimpeded down the street, forcing a kid like me to wonder what lay inside this odd edifice. You have to understand that in many of Philadelphia's inner cities, unlike Hudson, for example, so many of the houses are exactly the same, conjoined like a series of train cars being pulled toward the Delaware River or somewhere off into the distance, depending almost completely on the creative and financial resources of the residents to distinguish one house from the other. It's a good thing there are addresses. That's all I'm saying. So Little John's was a small wonder. And inside Little John's, there was always a barrel of pungent brine. And swimming in that brine were the largest dang dill pickles you'd ever seen, that I'd ever seen, bigger than any pickles I've seen since. And it wasn't just that they were big, they were fully pickled, so thoroughly saturated that the first bite might close your mouth altogether in a tight vinegar clinch. So what I'm saying is that I'd rush from my mother's wholesome Campbell's soup lunch, which I now realize I owe such an amazing debt, and head straight for Little John's. There, for a mere quarter, I would dive into that barrel and spear my catch. And from there, I was destined back to school, obviously unconcerned with the damage that pickle might do to my natural cologne. I remember walking out of Little John's with this big pickle and literally skipping up the street. Skipping, I tell you. And in this memory, the sun fanned brilliant light all about, and the bricks were vivid red and the asphalt the deepest black, and I was just so happy. This is proof I was innocent then. Only someone who is innocent, only someone who is without guilt can skip. The slightest weight of guilt will take the skip right out of your gate. But on this day, there were no suspicious eyes on me, no sense of outsiderness, of being the son of a demon, nor a criminal. I was just the happiest little black boy sucking on my dill pickle and tra-la-lying home. And you have to know there's an art to eating a pickle, but I will refrain from the details of this joy, for in a world colored by a brilliant but only half-ripe pioneer psychotherapist, who shall not be named here, my description would almost certainly be misinterpreted. It must then suffice to say that I know that once I was innocent, and by innocent, I mean that I knew the world was open to me, that I was without guilt, that no one suspected me of any crime. How special this was for an African-American boy to be able to skip effortlessly down the street. But more to the point, imagine how rare it is today. Black boys are suspected of criminal intent so early in their lives these days, they hardly ever get a full measure of innocence, which, by the way, I believe is essential to being a healthy adult. We must know what it means to feel innocent. It's one of the most significant benchmarks in a person's life. I know that my mother understood this and did the only thing a parent can do. She tried in so many ways to preserve my innocence as long as she could. No one else told me that no matter how smart you are, how much you believe that you could do anything you put your mind to, the truth is the energy that you need to be whole in this culture will be taken from you as a rite of passage. Those are your dues as a Black person in America. You must give up your innocence, be seen as guilty, eventually feel guilty before you even get a chance to demonstrate your potential. Justice for me begins here. When the world we live in marks us because of skin color or language differences, it begins a story about us that we have to fight to get control of. My story is for me to tell. Your story is for you to tell, and we all have one. And it is unjust that some of us inherit the wound of bad stereotypes that I promise you actually are the cause of so much injustice. Throwing this off, shaking off this load, to paraphrase Erykah Badu, of negative images and stereotypes is the first challenge people of color have in this culture. And there is very little training for this challenge. This is my work. Because as I've said, we have to identify the place where injustice rather than justice is created or strengthened. And it is there we must begin to rebuild our cultural fabric. Yes, I'm telling you that we have to create a new way of seeing each other, a new way of talking to each other, even though there is unrest all around us in this divided country, even though the toxic cloud of racial tension threatens to thicken around us. Even in this world, I'm saying we must fight for our own individual innocence, the right to tell our own story, the right to be who we naturally are, devoid of the cloak of negative images and stereotypes that attempt to define us. So as I said, this is my work. I'm out to build an army of teachers, in this case, who sign on to the challenge of freeing our children from the stereotypes they live in bondage to. One day, I will also be out to create an army of doctors and nurses who are doing the same thing for patients of color. And just to put a point on that, when our children begin to embrace their innocence, that is when they stop relying on stereotypes to tell them how to feel, how to react, they suddenly become better students, more engaged, more openly curious. This is where the new fight for justice must begin, with our children. So let me spend some time now talking specifically about the innocent classroom as a way of addressing how relationships can impact race. When I think of children of color, in my head, in my dreams, when their images are disconnected from reality, they appear as I see or saw myself as a child. Curious, energetic, smart, brilliant even, innocent. Innocent, yes, innocent. Young, gifted, and innocent. You are looking at someone who is deeply engaged in the training of educators to achieve a moral and ethical way of interacting with and engaging the amazing potential of children of color. And just as a point of, I just want to stop for a second to say, Heather, that is really important for me, to me. I just want to make a correction. We've trained over 10,000 educators in this country now. Since that, wherever that was printed, that number is way out of date. We are growing. We're in a lot of different cities now. I won't go into all the details of that. I'm really not here to market the innocent classroom as much as I am to talk about the qualities that have manifested themselves in the context of this work. And to try to squeeze out of that a little bit of the lessons that I feel like we can actually begin talking about. Over the past 10 years, I have largely stepped back from directly talking about race publicly, as I focused on the development and growth of the work I do now in trying to implement the innocent classroom throughout the country. I mean, this is my way of expressing a deeply held belief that white educators, indeed all educators, but let's be honest, 85% of all the teachers and educators in this country are white. That especially white educators could be helped to become the kind of educators who could look into the eyes of a Black child or any child of color and see potential brilliance. And for them to believe they could in fact activate that brilliance regardless of their race or background or economic status. And in this interaction was quite possibly the seed of freeing children of color from the bondage they exist under. Bondage, yes, the bondage of negative stereotypes and iconography that accompanies them into every relationship with the world outside of their homes and families. If every educator could look into the eyes of every child of color and see the brilliance there and seek to unlock it, to see their humanity, well, what would that portend? Think about that for a second, because I believe this is possible. In our efforts to impact children of color by improving the relationships between them and their educator, teachers, we have discovered a very powerful and transformative innovation that may well provide a concrete and doable capacity to change the way we approach our movement and race relations in general. Now, this work is molecular. A molecular pathway to growing new generations of children and adults who approach racial realities in a way that undermines division. So while much of my talk will focus, on children and teachers and the classroom and the relationships that are formed in that environment, I want you to see that in these relationships, when they are successful, is an answer to some of the most difficult racial challenges that exist before us. My work is not about global change. It is about impacting each classroom, each office, and the children who exist there, and the educators who are there to teach and support them. That is the universe we must transform first. Think about it. Think of all the positive impact that can flow from a collection of classrooms, schools, districts, and so forth if every child not only learned to the highest level of their ability, but also moved into the world having experienced the power of unbiased relationships with the people, the adults who are charged with educating them. Alone, that would change the world. And think of the power and knowledge those educators would be in possession of. Again, if that's, the thing that happens in our work is we work with educators to be better in relationship with the kids of color. But what happens is those people, those educators change themselves, and then they change their families and their children. So it's not a one-way proposition. This process of change and transformation and growth is meant for all of us. Yes, I am saying that the potential of racial progress, if it can be achieved, and I believe it can be driven by educators. When I say things like that, I'm reminded of a teacher, a veteran math teacher, who stood up at the end of our training cycle and said, I've been teaching for 32 years and I've been to, I don't know how many professional development programs on teaching math, but this is the first time anyone has helped me understand the students in my class that I'm supposed to be teaching. This is our truth. We make so many assumptions about people that aren't true, that actually are stereotypes, that hide the truth about people to the point that we are left clueless, and in that process, everyone loses. There are tough times ahead for us. We may have to survive challenges to humanity. Maybe we already are. We may have to actually redefine humanity in such a way that everyone is seen, everyone is known, where all stories by all peoples are valued and considered. We as a country have not had to do that. We have existed in a culture that has prioritized the stories of some and marginalized the stories of others. We will have to learn how to grow out of this. The truth of racial inequality has been revealed. And I think the response to the George Floyd murder, the uprisings and all of that happened, has taken the cover off again in our culture in such a way that I don't believe it can be put back again. I don't think this can be ignored anymore. In every action, and every transaction that involves a multiplicity of people and cultures and races, the question of fairness is going to follow. The question of whose truth governs those actions and transactions will be immediately asked. And if we are to free our children to achieve the most they can from our system and the world around them, we must prepare ourselves for that work. And it will indeed require effort. We must muster up the transformational energy that seems impossible, but isn't. I believe we have to go through what we are currently experiencing. I don't like it. I didn't live this long to have to deal with all this stress, all the danger and the violence that we are suffering from, and what I think is on the edges of our immediate future. I just think we have to go through this to get past some of the issues that have dominated the news, race issues that exist in law enforcement, in healthcare, in economics, at work, and perhaps most significantly, as I've been talking about, in education. Almost every aspect of American life is beset by issues of race. It's pretty deep, not unreachable. I believe it is a demand of our culture. If we are bound to be the community, the culture, the country, the society we can be, we must ultimately get through all of this. And I'm not a cheerleader in this response because I don't think it's a given, but I just believe. And believe it or not, in sessions, it just makes me think of another moment where another teacher, almost in tears, confessed to the group we were in of about maybe 50 other educators that she had a student that she felt she actually hated. And when she said it, there was this audible gasp in the room. Like, that's something teachers don't usually confide. She was obviously at her wit's end with this student, and as she talked more about him and the way he behaved toward her, you could almost understand why she felt that way. But the truth was she didn't know him. She only knew what he did in front of her, what was in his heart. Or better yet, using the language of the innocent classroom, the question was, what was his good? I promised her that she would feel differently about him by the time we had completed the training, and she did. And she had to prepare herself for that journey. She had to let go of so much bad information about him, this kid, that drove her instincts. She had been blind to his good, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But once she saw it and responded to it, things changed. And near the end of the session, at the end, she stood up and told the room how salvational it had been to go through that process with him. It had changed him, and it had changed her. From the beginning of my work with educators, I believe that guilt is the biggest barrier to the success of students of color. I define this guilt as the cumulative impact of negative stereotypes that are internalized by all of us, but especially our children at a very young age. I call it guilt because as it's internalized, it causes children to behave in ways that they are supposedly destined to behave. It's almost like they have been told this is what they are long enough for it to be who they are. This ideology governs much of what we see in children and how we interpret their behavior. Guilt erodes the important and necessary relationship that is required between an adult and a child, a teacher and a student. But consider this, what is it that we know about each other? I mean, what is it? It is mostly generalized knowledge, and most of that is embedded in stereotypes, and most of those are negative. This is our first fight. We must refuse to accept that what the culture tells us about each other is accurate. All stereotypes are false. All right, you can hear the chat room running right now. Let me say that again. All stereotypes are false. In your house, in your classroom, in your office, everywhere you dominate, stereotypes should have no place. Yes, there are those who claim stereotypes stem from the truth. In actuality, stereotypes are always inaccurate, despite where they originate, because they imply certainty, absoluteness. Besides breathing, there are few things, if any, that are absolute in people. Heartbeat. All Black people don't play basketball, to quote Maya. All police aren't bad. We are individuals, human, unique. One of the first things I might do when I'm in front of a group of educators is ask them to tell me what America tells them about the children of color in their classrooms. Let's stop for a moment. I want you to do this exercise with me. It won't take long. You just need a piece of paper to write on. Something to make notes on. I'm going to ask you this question. And you don't have to share this with anybody else. In fact, if you're sitting in a room with other people, you might want to cover it. And you can tear it up, burn it, throw it away, or you can eat it once we're done. If you remember, Maxwell Smart, get smart, like write a secret down on a piece of paper and then eat it. One word answers are fine. Just make a list. What does the American society tell you about people of color? Not what you think or believe, but what does this culture say about them? Often I have to prod respondents not to be too polite. Oh, they're very rhythmic. They dance, they play sports good, they sing good. I'm not talking about that stuff. I'm talking about, well, that's a part of it. You can add that to your list. But speak the truth about messages about people of color that have just become a part of the air around us, that we don't even question. Or if we question, we only have so much energy. We only have so much time to question things. When I first did this exercise, we could, every time we do this, we can paper the wall with the answers. If your list is anything like their list, it might feel a little disheartening, a little disturbing, and very sad. And it would help put into context some of the comments that you've heard from the students who have made their recordings for you. This list can be devastating. They are angry, disrespectful, disobedient, poor, I won't do well in school. I'm not going to go down my list. In fact, I wasn't going to do even that, because your list is good enough. But even those words I just speak, a very small sample from an unbelievably long list, and that list is not a good list. But this is not what, and again, this is not what you think or what the teachers think, but what they absorb from popular culture. And to make matters worse, it's really important to think this through. Our children know that the culture portrays them this way. They know that, they know the words on your list and on the teacher's list, they know. And even more profoundly problematic is the fact that many of our children of color believe that you believe these negative narratives about them, that you believe that you've walked into this trap about who people are from a stereotypical point of view, from a negative narratives, negative pictures, negative iconography, the movies, the games we play, the music that is played, is just all around us, these stereotypes. So we're not just talking about children now. These stereotypes affect how we engage with each other as adults as well. This is the barrier we all face. We have to overcome these narratives in order to see the humanity in each other. We must understand and then discard the negative stereotypes that are at work before we engage with others, especially children of color. You have to go through this work, and we have to understand how these stereotypes also make script. For the next few minutes, I'm going to be specifically, it's not different than what I've been doing, but I'm talking about students and teachers. But I want you to try to see yourself, if you're not a teacher or not a student, I want you to see yourself in this conversation, whether you're an educator or not. I want you to understand that what I'm talking about extends to all of us in every walk in this country. We all behave or perform in some way that is connected to what we think others expect of us. Sometimes it becomes a script. Head down, uninterested, distracted, cynical, silent, for example. I want you to consider that very often these stereotypes are internalized as guilt. If you believe I'm not smart, not respectful, angry, uninterested, then that is often what I'll give you. It's easier that way. But we want to unburden our children of this weight and the script that follows from it. And children will let go of the script and the impact of negative stereotypes in an environment of innocence. It's all dependent on our ability to create a functional relationship with them in an environment that is bereft of these negative stereotypes. As I've said, this work is molecular. Each of us must be engaged in removing the guilt that is caused by negative stereotypes in every manifestation that we engage in our lives. That's why it doesn't matter where you are. There are people of color working, in the stores that you go to. There are people delivering food to you. They're all around us. And all of that is sort of wrapped into this story. So your first challenge is to be aware of the negative stereotypes and to authentically convince the people around you, especially the people of color around you, that you are going to see them through a stereotype-free lens to the largest extent possible. And this convincing need not be verbal. In fact, it's hard to convince somebody of that. In fact, it's better if it's not. Showing is always better than telling. As a writing instructor, that comes easy for me to say. Show, don't tell. In a classroom, for example, the only way to dismantle this guilt and the script it creates is to find a child's good and respond to it. And I talk about good, I went back to Aristotle, believe it or not. Aristotle developed a definition of good that I just love. He says that good is that for which all else is done. I could go into a much longer soliloquy about Aristotle, but you'd have to invite me back next year for another conversation. But in Aristotelian philosophy, this idea of good from the Aristotelian way of looking at it is the origin, the motivation behind behavior, the only way to, so it is the beginning of who we are and what we do and why we do it. All of us have good. And the only way to transform guilt into innocence is to engage a child's good, because it's the only way a child's ever going to believe you see them effectively. Good is the cause of all action. It is the source that drives our children. It offers the answer to the question, why? You've already written down a list of guilts. Now think about the source of need: to be cared for, to be seen, to be heard, to feel safe, to feel connected. Those are goods. So we say, if you can identify a good in a child, your chances of impacting that child rise dramatically. In our trainings, we ask teachers to find a child's good as a precursor to developing any strategy for engaging with them. Does the child feel like no one cares for her? That no one really sees or ever really listens to her unless she's getting into trouble? That she's unsafe? Our children are often driven by deep yearnings in an attempt to express their good. And the way it works is like if you never feel safe, you often are doing things that cause other people not to feel safe either. So it's sort of counterintuitive. But if you work with it and really focus on what the child is, where the child is coming from, and we have a whole process of identifying good. It's also in the book, Innocent Classroom, if you want to know more about it. But good in the way I'm using it is neither positive or negative. It's not good versus evil or bad or impure. It is neutral. Finding a person's good, the reason why they behave a certain way, is the beginning of our process of relationship building. For some educators, this is a challenging concept, but for others, not so much. It can be done. Our teachers are doing it. When our educators are presented with a child who seems opaque, difficult to understand, or difficult to reach, they are asked to discover that child's good. That's the journey. One example of a child's good could be belonging, as in, I'm behaving this way because I don't feel like I belong anywhere. Another example, as I said, could be safe, as in, I never feel safe. And lo and behold, there are a lot of children who never feel safe. And if a person begins to create an environment where they do feel safe and where they know that somebody is looking out for them, and all of that stuff stops. All of the behaviors change. The relationship begins to flower at that point. Educators are asked to know a child well enough to guess at their good. And sometimes you have to guess, it's fine. You don't have to be spot on. But when you can identify a good and respond to it, the beauty of Aristotelian good is there is one immediate byproduct. Empathy spontaneously springs into life. When you can identify a person's good and respond to it effectively, that person looks up at you in a way they never looked at you before then. It is the look of an empathetic face. And the very beginning of a relationship is at that moment struck. And in the unfolding of this relationship, a child can be welcomed into a place, an office, a classroom, a house where negative stereotypes are not at work, where negative stereotypes lose their power. I realize that I'm running a little on the time side. What do you think, Heather? Should I?
I'm torn because I, like so many other folks, I think I am making notes and have so many thoughts, and yet there's a part of me, so there's a part of me that doesn't want you to stop talking, Alex, and yet I'm guessing folks would welcome the opportunity to field a few questions. So yeah, it would be nice to maybe have a few minutes at the end for some questions. If there's a way that you can do that, that feels like we're not just.
I can. I think, let me just, I'll jump to the end. I think I've made most of the points that I wanted to make.
Oh, well, that was quick.
No, just give me 1 minute here.
Yeah, okay.
Every person has a good, but you must be able to see and engage someone's good in order for them to feel innocent in your presence. This is molecular anti-racist work. Mass molecular racial growth begins with us in our homes, our schools, but we have to be ready and willing to do this work. This readiness is individual. Some must understand and accept anti-racial theory and practice, or what some are calling abolitionism. Some must understand and accept issues of diversity and cultural competency. Some must de-escalate the cumulative anger and resentment that has accumulated within them from years of struggle. And some must overcome their fear of the other. This preparation can extend a lifetime. But in the meantime, if we turn our energies to our children and begin a molecular approach, we can change their lives and move our society forward. And that's what I'm proposing to you today. Unburden our children, free them from the bondage of negative expectations, negative stereotypes. To quote from Amistad, give us free. And in so doing, begin or continue the challenge of racial equity in the places that you control. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Alex. I know that we do have some educators on our call today, some early childhood educators, some K-12 educators, some higher ed folks. So would love to see some of their questions. And one thing I did want to ask, Alex, before we jump into questions, and I'm hoping I'm not catching you without warning, but I'm guessing you've been asked this question before. I imagine there might be some folks listening who are wondering, so why is this about race? Why isn't this about all kids and an approach that, why do we have to make this about race? Why isn't this about all kids and looking for the good in all kids? I'd welcome your thoughts on that, Alex.
Well, I think first of all, go back to that list you made. I think that sort of explains it right there. The capacity of this culture to create and prepare all of us to see each child separately, equally, and fairly is not viable. It doesn't exist. Consequently, we have to strip away. And plus the benefits, I mean, I'm not here to talk about white privilege and all that, but there is some truth to some of this, right? So there is privilege. There's a way in which some kids can have issues and get through school and have a great life. A lot of our children are clamped down on before they never get a chance to fully express themselves as human beings and live a full life. I just think race, this is our country. This is what we've done to ourselves. And we have to start somewhere to undo. And so part of this this undoing is changing the way teachers look at our children, the way our children look at our teachers, and then the way our teachers respond to their families. And so it becomes this molecular and spreading reality. I just think it's something, it's a wishful idea that we could not have to deal with race about this, but we would not be moving the needle if we didn't do that.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm trying to bring a couple comments together here and questions. Alex, one of the things you talked about is how for the last 20 years or 10 years, I think you said, you haven't really been talking about race as much as focusing on this one. I don't want to say small because your choice is a pretty big area of work, but small work. And I think for many of us, and I'm seeing this in some of the questions, we're thinking about, so how can we, while not addressing the entire systemic problem, how can we in our own worlds, in ways where we do have some influence, how can we take action? So there's a comment from someone wondering about, is there a way that is there an exercise we can do with our own children to help them start to be seeing how race impacts our lens. Someone's asking about a Head Start program and how would I go about bringing this to my Head Start program. So I'd welcome your thoughts about people with whom this is resonating, this idea that I don't have to boil the ocean, but you do need to pick something. Kind of where are the resources? How do you identify the thing, the area where you might be able to have some influence?
So I would begin with a trip to innocentclassroom.com, particularly for the organizations and people who are thinking about, well, maybe my organization, it could be useful. And actually, we're doing this work in early childhood now as well. But again, with childcare workers, to help them understand what the children, even the youngest of their children, are dealing with right now. So there is that. And I think an email to me through the website, I'd be happy to respond to. But this is as much about the world, like I've said this, like the world you control. Like the world you control has an extended impact on this culture that ripples. Like the people who work for you, the people who are vendors of yours, if you have a small business, it's the unwillingness to accept negative articulations about who people are without some understanding of who they are. It's like, I will not allow this to happen in my face right now. I'm not trying to make a big deal about this, but I'm not supporting somebody to just go around and say negative things about people of color for no reason, or just because that's the way. So I think being in control of your space and saying, in my space, negative stereotypes have no place. It's a good place to start. And because we have presidents, you have political officials, you have all kinds of people in this room. I know that. You have a lot of power, and it's hard to do that in isolation as not a part of a movement. But I'm saying this is how it has to happen. This is how our country has to grow. We have to grow, or we're just going to be going round and around and around. And I'm personally tired. Yeah. Does that get at it?
I think so. And, I'm sorry that we're running out of time. I really appreciate the invitation to reach out to you through the website, Alex, with questions. Lot of excitement in the chat and sharing of experiences.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't, normally my talks are too short. And so I added stuff, and then it's like, I looked up and I'm like, oh no. And then I talked about my power thing, and I'm still doing it right now. So obviously, I would much prefer being in conversation with you and with the people in this room than I am talking at you, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, and maybe we can end with this. And Stacy, if you could present the poll results. I know one challenge I personally have, Alex, and one thing I've heard from others in this region is that many of us don't have a lot of opportunity to interact with folks who aren't white, and it's a lot harder to see the ways that those stereotypes are playing out when you don't have somebody maybe who's going to call you on them. So, we can call one another, but, looking at the results of this poll, you can see, many of us have no or just a few interactions. So any thoughts about that? I know our schools are doing a better job trying to have curriculum and books where kids see themselves and where they're experiencing other culture, but that's not the same as having a family, a neighbor, a friend.
I agreed. But I would say starting with a reading list is also not a bad idea. I think reading is one of the ways in which you can extend that connection. But also, I'm hesitant. I'm hesitant to accept even the truth of that poll. Like, there's a part of me that is like, I just want to say, I suspect your engagement with people of color is bigger than you think it is. I just want you to really think about all the people that you come in contact when you're on vacation. I don't think this is about, it could be about intimate relationships. And obviously the whole idea of understanding good and building relationships from good is about creating serious, significant relationships. But the first step is not accepting wrong, inaccurate, perceptions about who the people are in the world that you exist in. But I will think about this a little bit more. I haven't really, what I say to educators, because when I go into a space, I'm not bringing books about what it means to be Native American or what it means to be Latinx, or I'm saying fall in love with a child. And then you'll know what you need to do to connect with them. You'll understand what they're eating, what their holidays are, but you have to go through this process. When you know a person's good, who's not like you, what you get to learn about them because you have to, because that goodness connects, that spontaneous empathy that is created, it drives you. So the educators are like, well, you didn't make us do this, but I'm doing this because I really want to help Kenny grow. So cool. I'm hesitant to have a program that's like, well, this is what you need to do and you need to do. I just think let's all of us open our eyes and really understand how integrated our relationships are and how they touch so many people that are gone from us. I mean, there's research to show that we walk into a store, we don't see people of color. We're doing this, we're doing that. I mean, the white customer is not necessarily seeing even all the people around them, not paying attention to the people who are banging their bags. And so it's to me, this begs for a longer kind of interaction in which folks can say, well, I do, and so I would have a better understanding of that. Coming from where I come from, I just know that my interactions with people are all over the place. There are lots of different people.
Well, Alex, I love that you are leaving us with this idea of starting by looking for people's good. And while maybe teachers or healthcare workers have more of an opportunity to do that, I think you've got many of us thinking about how we might too make some space to look for and learn about people's good as we are, especially folks who aren't like us. So I thank you. I thank you for all of your time and wisdom, the time you put into getting ready for today, and your time and your wisdom today. Thank you so much. I also want to thank our partner and sponsor, First State Bank and Trust, and thank all of you for being here with us today and for committing to be part of this continuing conversation here in the Valley. We will send an email in the next 24 hours with links to a recording of these remarks. So if there's someone you wish was here today and you want to share them, please share that link. We'll also have a link to a discussion guide, some reading list, all of those videos of those teens who shared a little bit of their story with us. That'll all be there. And again, we really encourage you to use these resources to facilitate continued conversations. That email will also have a link to a survey, and I hope you will take a few minutes to complete it. Among other things, we are starting to get ready and planning for next year's Conversations of the Valley series, and so your feedback is really helpful as we do our best to develop programming that is going to be meaningful to all of you. So our website is SCV for St. Croix Valley, scvfoundation.org. From there, you can learn more about the foundation, about Conversations of the Valley, and or find contact information for all of us. I know I speak for the entire staff team when I say we would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining.
I just want to say thank you all for being so patient with me and for going through this. I appreciate it very much.
You are welcome,
Thank
Alex.
you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.